Mechanical watchmaking in the grand scheme of things is a heavily involved process that requires a remarkable amount of human labor. This has created a romanticized view of the industry that is, for the most part, true. Yet the catch-all nature of how this is perceived sometimes falls short of telling the proper story, as watches have a range of complexity, with each brand having preferences on how things are done. As someone who has been fortunate to see behind the scenes of dozens of watchmaking headquarters and manufacturers, I wanted to try to piece together taking everything that I've learned about how watches are made and then look at the types of watchmaking in the industry that you'll find and break it down into a single video. So how this is going to be broken down is 3 parts. The first part is going to be the reshaping of perspective of how watches are actually made. Part 2 is the who's who, an introduction to suppliers and groups that ultimately make watchmaking in the 21st century possible. And then we have part 3, the types/tiers of watchmaking in the industry. So I know many of you are gonna wanna skip around in this video, especially just to see the types and tiers of watchmaking at the end, but if you can, stick with me up until then. I've really tried to meticulously craft each section of this video in order for full comprehension, and without some of the context, it could cause some confusion and misunderstanding. First, it's important to establish that the watchmaking industry spawned from small beginnings, with many early operations being family-led and owned companies. Over the years and ultimately centuries, the field evolved with companies scaling within densely packed pockets of production, most notably operating in countries such as Switzerland, Germany, and Japan. Watchmaking is brand-centric, meaning we are very much drawn to the name on the dial as collectors, thinking that the brand itself produced everything that ends up in the package. This is where we hear terms like in-house getting thrown around when speaking about movements especially. The concept of in-house watchmaking in most cases is guided in language that is often misconstrued to mean a brand relies on no one outside of its walls of operation to get the job done. However, the truth is, from entry-level brands to high horology players, the reliance on specialized suppliers allows the industry to thrive. Let's think about it. Even in the simplest form, mechanical watches consist of well over 100 components, only getting more complicated from there. For most brands, it is ludicrous to believe it's feasible to do it all alone. Even in instances where brands are doing the majority of the work in-house, many will rely on specialists to supply small parts. Just to throw out some examples, and there are a lot of them here, we're talking cases, bracelets, crowns, straps, bridges, screws, jewels, main plates, dials, hairsprings, shock absorbers, balance wheels, mainsprings, clasps, wheels, hands, and much more. To some of you, this might already be understood, but to others, this might be having you question the overly romantic way in which you view the industry. Regardless of where you are in your awareness, what I want to make clear is that despite what some believe, this is a good thing. Say it with me. Suppliers are beneficial to the brands and to us as consumers. In nearly every other trade, we accept this idea without issue. It is only in the last few decades in horology that there was a push towards in-house language, making it appear as if it was an all or nothing concept, when in reality, it is a spectrum and involves understanding company ownership structure to know where to draw the line, a line that is more inconsequential than many believe. Now, if you're like me, you want an exceptional watch for the price at the end of the day. And a watch produced entirely by a brand is only worth it if the product is well made. Without suppliers, many of the names you know of would have never arisen as global powerhouses. Let's use a team sport as an example. I'm gonna use soccer or football for my analogy because I know I have a global audience and you probably don't wanna hear me talk about the NBA, the MLB, or the NFL. A midfielder is probably the most well-rounded player out there. They can do a little bit of everything well. But there's a reason there are not 11 midfielders representing a team on the pitch, as what makes a great team are specialized players in specific roles such as a striker, a goalkeeper, or a center back. Whether on the field or in watchmaking, generalists in skill at every position don't generally create good results. Instead, they lead to unfocused inadequacy where excellence is the target. What has ultimately led to this shift in consumer thoughts around watches has come as a byproduct of the consolidation of the industry where brands and specialists fall under larger umbrellas. Up until the 1990s, the use of the term in-house was absent from the buying discourse. So why did this change? As groups and brands got large enough to acquire the suppliers, this became a unique value proposition to push in marketing, as the organization now can claim in-house capabilities just by writing a check and leading the previous outside operation. Is there anything wrong with this? Absolutely not, but it does now further remove collectors from understanding that watchmaking is just as much a supplier industry as a brand one. To better drive home the ideas I'll be speaking about, we must explain a few terms before we proceed. Two important terms to know regarding movements are Bosch versus complete calibers. What both of these terms are getting at is how movements are being partly or completely assembled by a third-party provider. And a Bosch refers to a movement that is not fully assembled, but includes many of the key parts like plates, bridges, and screws, but will lack components like a balance, the escapement, and the mainspring. Whereas a complete caliber will be a fully assembled movement provided by a supplier. The most common examples of brands providing these types of movements are names you have likely heard of, such as Edda, Sellita, and McWhorter, with this only scratching the surface. Further, calibers from players like Edda and Sellita have different grades of the same caliber, coming with higher regulation at the elevated tiers to hit chronometer specs and are usually having it up finished. Some brands will simply drop in a complete movement into a case, add the dial, hands, conclude with some final tests, and call it a day. While others will have a Bosch movements that will go through a more involved process with the assembly and regulation. There are also even instances where brands will use a Bosch movements as a base to then heavily modify the package and refinish the components to their desired spec. A Bosch and complete movements shouldn't be looked down upon, as it's pretty common practice even in higher end brands. For example, high horology brands for years would use Lemania-based chronograph calibers that were then modified to hit the in-house finishing standards of Patek Philippe and Vacheron Constantin. Movements are the most challenging and expensive aspect of high-end watch manufacturing, hence why brands will oftentimes rely on external calibers, as the economics of producing something from scratch are rarely worth the squeeze given the R&D required. Another term you may have heard of is a manufacturer. This is a French term that has come to represent a brand that will produce all or nearly everything in-house, including making some small components from raw materials. Like the theme thus far, manufacturers are not always completely self-sufficient, as there will be times to call on external suppliers. Another point is that a manufacturer is language usually used when describing a brand, not a group. This is a very loaded term with a ton of gray area, and we'll discuss some different examples later on. But what I will ensure and clarify at this point is that a manufacturer is not only reserved for luxury names, it is more of a methodology of how watches are produced. As we shift to part 2 in this video, this section is mostly here to illuminate examples of how suppliers have helped make it all possible. As a quick reminder, as much as the industry's consolidation was a capitalist exercise where conglomerates came in and swooped up the struggling names, it was also an act of stabilizing the volatile horological landscape of the late 20th century. When a company can own every aspect of its complicated supply chain, they have a higher likelihood of preserving long term. Further, if a company falls underneath a broader group, it will reap the benefits of having specialized names under that same group. It is also advantageous for groups to use their internal suppliers to make components and even do some assembly at times, as it is more cost effective, with the completed package often being better as a result. The work that is done is ultimately the same. Who is doing it might just be slightly different than what the average watch buyer might suspect. So I will not be going through every single brand/group, but I do want to introduce some as ways to better explain these ideas quickly. So let's address the big one, Rolex and Tudor. Although exchanging resources within the group does happen, Tudor and Rolex are more independently operated than they once were. As back in the day, suppliers and parts used for their watches were very similar. For example, Tudor Submariner cases back in the day were often Rolex signed. Nowadays, it is more complex, with each brand having specialized specs for their watches and different vested interests in suppliers. For Tudor, the most famous affiliation is the brand's majority ownership of Canisi. Canisi is the movement testing ground for Tudor, which has allowed the brand to develop its MT calibers, which have now become widely available in their watches. Rolex, on the other hand, has made aggressive moves over the last quarter century, where they have become as vertically integrated as any. Their way of doing this was through the acquisition of former suppliers. Just to provide some examples here, Verre et Jolie Poli, a case and bracelet finisher, was acquired by the brand. Bayalaire, a dial manufacturer. Bonici, a crown supplier. And Eglaire, a Biel-based watch movement supplier that is now a part of the Rolex organization since 2004. For context, that deal for their movement supplier is said to have been in excess of 1 billion Swiss francs, providing point that in-house capabilities at scale are not cheap. Next, let's look at the Swatch Group, perhaps the best example of an organization that utilizes group-owned specialists across brand lines. They own names like Etta, the largest producer of Swiss Bosch calibers, Niverox, a supplier of small escapement parts for many in the industry, Commodore, a manufacturer of synthetic rubies, sapphire crystals, and ceramics, Mecco Swiss, who specializes in crowns, RW, who's the leader in watch dial making, along with several others. Further, the Swatch Group shares resources amongst its brands. For example, you have Blancpain that operates the old Frederic Piguet factory, giving them in-house capabilities that can benefit others within the group. Also, Breguet, before the Swatch Group acquired them, owned Lemania, which was then inherited by Swatch as a result, reuniting Lemania and Omega under the same group structure once again following the dissolution of the SSIH group in the 1980s, where Omega and Lemania were both owned under that structure. This was a big move given the Speedmaster's long-term use of Lemania-derived calibers. Then in Japan, you have the Citizen Watch Group, which now owns one of the largest mechanical movement suppliers in the world, Miyota. Its Swiss movement manufacturer, La Joux Perret, has increased their market share rapidly in recent years, with Citizen also having a machining wing of its portfolio that plays a crucial role in the global watchmaking stage. This includes producing some of the top CNC machines under the brand Syncom, which are used in a variety of fields, but this know-how has allowed them to have a unique ability to be independent in producing their parts. LVMH, the largest luxury group in the world, has been adding to its watch division quickly, with brands that have many in-house capabilities like Zenith and Bulgari, with one of their most notable swings as of late being the acquisition of La Fabrique du Temps in 2011. The now internal firm serves as the group's movement provider for high horology concepts, which has already been put to use with the relaunching of the Daniel Roth brand and the reimagined watchmaking of Louis Vuitton. Richemont is the second largest luxury group in the world behind LVMH, but is a very serious player on the watchmaking side. Its in-house movement manufacturing arm, Val Fleurier, is used by various brands within the group, from Baume & Mercier with their Balmatic caliber to Vacheron Constantin with the development of the 1326 caliber found in the entry-level 56. Further, Richemont commonly exchanges capabilities across the group. A shining example of this is JLC, who have supplied calibers to other brands for decades. And as one final example, we have Audemars Piguet, which I wanted to include because they exemplify another key aspect of the industry that can often happen, which is the acquisition of high complications. In the 1980s, two former watchmakers from AP started a firm known as Renault and Papy, which specialized in higher complications such as tourbillons and repeaters. After doing work for Audemars Piguet during the 80s and 90s, AP eventually decided to acquire the firm, and it is also a key resource for Richard Mille's movement production, a company that Audemars Piguet partly owns as well. In addition, AP acquired the case and bracelet maker Centror SA, which was crucial for developing their vertical integration. So now we can finally discuss some of the different levels of watchmaking. A crucial, and I mean crucial, disclaimer as we proceed here is that the following categories we will be referring to, they're not going to neatly house a brand in its entirety, as there tends to be a spectrum within a brand on the level of work they do. Again, all the methods of watchmaking included in this list are not intended to be a list saying that one is ultimately better than the other, nor should it be followed simply as a linear progression of better. All of these watchmaking types can produce a quality watch, and on the other side can also produce a lackluster watch for that tier. And also note that these are not universal standards of ways of judging different types of watchmaking. This is simply my internal interpretation, trying to package this as someone who's fortunate to be able to see much of what happens behind closed doors in the industry. As a way to better follow the types of watchmaking, let's make sure we're all on the same page with breaking down the core 4 stages of watch assembly. When you enter a watchmaking facility, you will hear phrases such as T0, T1, T2, and T3 as numbered steps in the watchmaking assembly process. These will often take place in separate parts of a larger facility or will be done at completely separate sites, even by specialists outside of the brand who gets no acknowledgement in the final package. T0 is the first step of the watch assembly process where small specialized components, which at times can be created by the brand itself, are brought in for pre-assembly. Think bridges, plates, wheels, screws, and other small components. For many brands, this step is done outside of their core operating facility, where small organized movement trays with parts are provided to continue with the rest of the assembly process. Next is T1, which consists of the assembly of the movement and final adjustments for regulated timekeeping. This is the stage with the largest variance in complexity depending on the caliber and the watch. T2 refers to the casing up of the completed movement while adding the dial, hands, and crown to the package. And then finally, T3 is where attachments like bracelets or straps are added and the final presentation box is prepared. Regardless of whether or not a brand is doing all of these steps, they will remain in some way or another through the help of specialists or suppliers, with varying degrees of complexity. Even in cases where brands are doing all of these steps in-house, some of the overly specialized parts will be sourced elsewhere. These first several types or tiers fall under what I will call industrial watchmaking. Industrial watchmaking refers to watches that are produced using larger scale production processes, using machines regularly for finishing, and usually relying on an assembly line approach rather than bespoke methods where one watchmaker completes a watch from start to finish. Please note that most watches produced today, including many luxury brands, are done through industrialized means. A safe assumption is that more volume, the higher the likelihood of an industrialized process. However, again, there is nothing wrong with this. This is not a derogatory term. Industrial watchmaking is still incredibly meticulous, relying on substantial amount of human labor. It just looks a lot different than the vision some people have where a single watchmaker is making everything in a dusty Swiss cabin in the mountains all independently. For the first tier under the industrial category, we have what I will call design and final assembly. This is primarily going to be a catch-all for smaller brands that don't have the means to operate large facilities to bring their process completely in-house. Instead, they will rely on outside partners to supply them with mostly everything, and in some instances, will even have the supplier assemble the watches for them off-site. This is where you're going to find many micro brands that have their design facilities in one country, but then will have their watches produced elsewhere overseas. I know I've been saying this a lot throughout this video, but I just want to be very clear, there's nothing wrong with this. How this level of watchmaking typically works is a brand will deliver designs or CAD files either in-house or with an outside designer to a supplier or suppliers that either create the parts or will work with their own suppliers to make the watch. A Bosch or complete calibers will be a core aspect of the process, with the movement dictating the design, given they will not have the ability to create a caliber from the ground up. The final delivery of what a brand will receive will either be in a Bosch caliber with key components like a dial, cases, hands, and bracelet attachments for the brand to assemble and test, or even a fully cased up watch that is provided by a key supplier or assembler. So referring back to before, brands in this tier mostly are going to be involved in just T2 or T3 of the assembly process, relying on suppliers for the early stages. The next watchmaking type includes mass-produced watch brands that will have more production capabilities than above, but the biggest distinction is that instead of looking to outside suppliers, they can look within a group to develop movements and other specialized parts. A great example of this will be some of the entry-level brands from the Swatch Group who will be supplied parts from internal specialists for the brand for them to do T2 and T3 as part of the assembly, and rarely some T1. What makes this also different from the above is these brands have facilities that allow them to be more capable of the assembly work and usually have more of a mature system for testing and regulation. Further, because these parts come from inside the group, there's usually more opportunity for proprietary concepts with cases, movements, etc. For this next tier, the biggest area of change will be a brand that is independent and has a larger in-house assembly facility as well as some proprietary tech in the process. This category shares similarities to the type above. The distinction is that the brand has to rely more heavily on external suppliers. However, they still have elevated internal capabilities in areas of testing, case construction, and movement regulation. For some examples here, let's include names like Zinn, Formex, Christopher Ward, Oris, and Hanhart. These brands will rely on external suppliers, but they are bringing proprietary skill sets to the table they have developed over the decades. For Zinn, some of their testing standards, oil-filled cases, and other features are interesting callouts. Formex utilizes a Bosch calibers for the most part, but Rafael Granito, the CEO, also works in tandem with his family's case and bracelet specialist, Dexel SA, who supplies some of the leading names in the industry. This is how they've managed to create cases for Formex watches, including patented ideas like their case suspension system in the Essence. Type 4 of watchmaking moves back from independent players to group players, but instead of what we previously discussed, the movements being assembled are either more or completely proprietary to the brand. In addition, the assembly process is also run more or entirely by the brand or by an owned subsidiary. Beyond the brands utilizing proprietary movements and other components, there might also be times when additional in-house testing can take place in the hope of complying with ISO or chronometer standards. Two of the best examples of this are brands brands like Longines and Tudor. Tudor owns Knisse, who is responsible for helping produce and provide proprietary calibers to Tudor to do final assembly and testing at their primary facility in the Lock. This is also where Tudor will showcase unique abilities such as testing for master chronometers and being able to do some custom engravings, where Longines will get proprietary caliber parts for their watches from group suppliers like ETA to assemble the watches from T1 to T3, following a watchmaking assembly process where specialists are responsible for distinct aspects of the watch's final completion. Now we get into what I will call industrial bespoke. As we move to this next level of watchmaking, this is where I want to remind everyone that brands tend to not perfectly sit into one category, and this next level is the perfect example of that. What this refers to are brands that have proprietary or in-house movements that are being supplied specialized parts from the internal group or brand support, but also venture into the world of higher complications or more bespoke watchmaking as well. For example, many of Omega and IWC's entry-level products are going to be created using industrialized techniques following the assembly line approach. However, they also have situations where more bespoke and technically impressive watches are being made using higher complications. In the case of IWC, you have the Kurt Claus perpetual calendars and more recently pieces like the Eternal Calendar, which are going to have a more involved process than an entry-level Portofino. Then for Omega, inside one of their watchmaking studios in Biel, they have multiple floors. One of those floors being for watchmakers that are assembling particular movements independently, as opposed to their more entry-level calibers like the 8800 series, which will go through the hands of multiple technicians prior to completion. A prime example of this is the 321, which has its own atelier where a single watchmaker is assembling the movement similar to historical methods, which leads to far less production, reportedly between 1,000 to 2,000 annually. Now for this next here, we have Haute, or high horology in English, and it represents a tier of watchmaking where the most involved watches in the world are being created. What qualifies a watch for high horology standards are ideas such as exquisite finishing, which happens on the individual component level, usually done entirely by hand or at least close to it. This is also where you're going to see more high complications being used. You have split-second chronographs, repeaters, tourbillons, carousels, and perpetual calendars, just to name a few. Further, you will see the introduction to fine crafts such as guilloche or rose engine work, hand-painted enameling, engraving, and gem setting. High horology brands will often produce most of their parts, but they can also still rely on external suppliers. Recall my examples earlier about Renault and Papy and La Fabrique du Temps, as well as another firm such as Chronode, who specializes in finishing, assembly, and prototyping for elite high horology concepts. So we hinted at this topic earlier, but now let's get into the deeper details. So a manufacturer is a French term. However, its definition in the industry is a brand that makes all or the majority of the parts that end up in their watches in an own facility by the brand. This also entails making small components from raw materials, and referring back to those phrases of assembly from earlier, manufacturers in the purest form will be responsible from T0, T1, T2 to T3 of the assembly process. Given the group structure, many notable names fall under. Being a true manufacturer doesn't make much sense, as internal suppliers that can do the job are more advantageous for cost and optimizing specialization. The brands that are manufacturers today are either independent or group brands that have developed their own in-house capability out of necessity, have historically been known as being a supplier to other brands, or have made a push to acquire former suppliers over the years to become more vertically integrated. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the most famous manufacturers in the industry are JLC, Grand Seiko, Rolex, Patek Philippe, Parmigiani Fleurier, and several brands in Glashütte, Germany like Nomos, Glashütte Reginal, and Lange. Being a manufacturer can span from the stratosphere of high horology to luxury industrial watchmaking, and then also to entry-level industrial watchmaking. To illustrate this with an example, Seiko is one of the most definitive manufacturers in watchmaking despite utilizing heavily industrialized methods. Another point to mention is this fact of isolation and how this can create more manufacturers. Japanese and German watchmaking are responsible for delivering a lot of vertically integrated brands since they don't have the same network of suppliers within their country's borders like Switzerland, creating more pressure on these brands for self-sufficiency. This is also an important time to mention that even ultra bespoke watchmaking where a single watchmaker is responsible can be considered a manufacturer. The best example of this is a method of the legendary watchmaker George Daniels, who famously mastered 32 of the 34 steps of watchmaking, where he would not only make small components, but finish and assemble them in his studio. This included making parts in historical ways with no automation, leading to this being known as the Daniels method, a philosophical approach to watchmaking that lives on with his protege, Roger Smith. So hopefully by this point, you realize that in-house capability is not what we should be judging when looking at a watch. Instead, we should be judging the final product's quality. Using great outsourced suppliers will always be superior to doing a lackluster job internally. Sure, some watches are more complex than others. However, the general outline of key steps of how a watch is made follows a similar path. It's just important to know when you're buying a watch for the name on the dial, you're also often buying the brand's ability to foster relationships with the industry's best suppliers as well as their own refined in-house capabilities. But all right guys, that is my video here today. As you could probably tell, this was a ton of work to put together. Basically was unpacking all of the experience that I have obtained from being able to travel and see a lot of these manufacturers as well as watchmaking headquarters around the globe. So if you learned something new, please give this video a thumbs up. That's a great indicator as well that you like these deep dives that are a little bit more educational in nature. So if you want to see more of this in the future, please let me know down in the comments below. Also, definitely check out teddybaldisher.com. How videos like this are possible is through selling watches on our site. So if you want to see more of this and you are in the market for a watch, we'd absolutely love to have your business. Every purchase from teddybaldisher.com comes with a full factory warranty, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support. We also have a full boutique in Cleveland, Ohio. If you're ever in the area, please do stop in. We have a team of watch enthusiasts running that store. They've been people that have been with me on this journey for quite a while. They'd love to see you if you're ever in the area looking to buy a watch. And also, if you have questions on our website about watches that are there for sale, feel free to reach out to us on live chat 18 hours a day. Our team is there, always wanting to help you out. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.